Elena Martinez clutched her bag tightly as she rushed down the crowded Manhattan sidewalk, dodging morning commuters with the practiced agility of someone who had done this too many times before. The wind tugged at the hem of her modest beige trench coat, and the chill in the early air stung her cheeks. Her phone buzzed again, a calendar notification reminding her of the internal interview scheduled for 9 o'clock sharp. She checked the time. It was already 8:47. 14 blocks and 28 floors stood between her and a chance at changing everything. The building loomed ahead like a glass monolith, its windows reflecting the steel-gray sky. Inside, behind a gleaming marble reception area, a uniformed concierge nodded politely to a man in an expensive suit who stepped effortlessly into one of the elevators. Elena picked up her pace, heels clicking rapidly against the polished floor as she headed for the same bank of elevators. But just as she reached out to press the button, a voice stopped her. "Excuse me," said the man by the wall, wearing a black suit and an earpiece. His build was square, posture military. Security. She turned to face him. "Yes." He looked her up and down, from her second-hand coat to the scuffed leather heels. His eyes were unreadable, but his tone was not. Support staff use the service stairs. "I'm not. I have an interview. On the 28th floor." He checked a clipboard that didn't seem to contain anything new. "If you're not on the executive list, you take the stairs." Elena hesitated. She could argue. She could protest. But time was ticking, and she knew how this would go. She'd seen it before, a woman who looked like her, speaking up, suddenly deemed aggressive or unprofessional. A scene would follow, a missed opportunity, a door closed for good. So she nodded silently and stepped back. The staircase door was tucked behind a gray wall, unmarked, utilitarian. She pushed it open. The heavy door groaned, and the metallic echo swallowed her whole. The climb began. Her legs burned after the 7th floor. She paused to wipe her forehead with the sleeve of her blouse, her breath short and shallow. She kept her eyes ahead. Her bag bounced against her hip with every step, and the sound of her own heartbeat filled the narrow space. By the 15th floor, her blouse clung to her back. She tasted salt in her mouth and forced herself not to look at the time. This wasn't just a building. It was a wall, and she had to climb it alone. Memories floated into her mind uninvited. Nights studying community college textbooks at the kitchen table after work, her father coughing in the next room. She had always done more with less, always climbed. At the 22nd floor, she stopped again, her hands on her knees. She could feel tears pressing behind her eyes, not of sadness, but exhaustion, injustice. But crying now would ruin everything. There was still a room waiting, for more floors. She climbed the last flight on sheer will. Her blouse was damp, her hair frizzed from sweat. She reached the 28th floor, pushed the door open, and stepped into a hallway wrapped in silence and soft lighting. Everything was beige and gold, like luxury trying not to show off. She walked past glass doors etched with the name of the dental practice group, Hudson Elite Clinics. Behind the final door, she could hear muffled voices. She smoothed her coat, swallowed hard, and stepped inside. The room was sleek, modern, filled with clean lines and expensive suits. A long glass table stretched across the center. At its head sat Claire Hudson, the company's CEO, poised, sharp, and perfectly styled. Elena recognized a few others from corporate, all seated, all looking as if they'd been waiting. But one face was unfamiliar. A man in his 30s, with tailored gray slacks and a deep navy sweater under a blazer. He wasn't like the others, not entirely corporate, not entirely out of place either. His gaze was fixed on her, assessing but not unkind. "Elena Martinez?" Claire said, a touch clipped. "Yes, I apologize. I was told to take the stairs." Claire didn't respond. The man leaned forward slightly. "You walked up 28 floors?" Elena hesitated. Everyone was watching her. She could downplay it, brush it off, or she could tell the truth. "Yes, I was stopped by security. He said I looked like I belonged in the service staff." The room went still. Someone shifted uncomfortably. Claire looked at the man across from her, her lips tightening. But he didn't look away from Elena. "Because they thought you were poor," he asked. Quietly, not with mockery but curiosity. She nodded once. Yes. No one spoke. The room had no idea what to do with that sentence. But the man held her gaze. And then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. Please, he said, motioning to the empty chair at the table. Have a seat. Elena sat, her heart still racing, not just from the climb, but from the silence that followed her words like a shadow. She didn't know it yet, but something had shifted. Someone had been waiting, and they had seen her. The chair beneath Elena felt colder than she expected. It was upholstered in a smooth cream fabric, undoubtedly expensive. And as she adjusted her posture, the subtle creak of the legs echoed louder than it should have. Around her, the meeting resumed, or rather, tried to. A slide presentation flickered back to life on a large screen at the far end of the room, casting soft light across the polished table. Charts, revenue numbers, strategic projections. Claire Hudson's voice returned to its rehearsed rhythm, but the energy in the room had shifted, like a curtain drawn back, letting in a draft no one could ignore. Elena kept her eyes on the screen, though she couldn't process a word. She was still catching her breath, not from the physical climb, but from the rawness of what had just happened. The man who had spoken, the only one who had acknowledged the way her words, now sat back, listening to Claire's presentation with a kind of restrained detachment, his fingers tapping once or twice against a closed leather notebook in front of him. She didn't know his name, but something about the way he carried himself made her think he wasn't here just to observe. The others, however, hadn't hidden their discomfort. The man seated 2 chairs down from Elena had coughed into his hand when she mentioned being denied the elevator. Another had shifted in his seat and avoided eye contact altogether. Claire, professional to the bone, simply pivoted the meeting forward, as if nothing unorthodox had occurred. That, more than anything, struck Elena. The ability to move on so quickly, so cleanly, as if her humiliation were an administrative hiccup, not an indictment of the culture inside those walls. 40 minutes passed, maybe more. She wasn't keeping track anymore. The room discussed regional expansions, cost optimization, patient experience initiatives. Elena spoke when prompted, brief, precise answers about front desk logistics, scheduling bottlenecks and patient intake improvements she had piloted at the flagship office downtown. But the tone in the room remained polite, performative. She was here because someone had insisted she be, not because anyone truly believed she belonged. When the meeting finally adjourned, people rose slowly, exchanging tight smiles and corporate pleasantries. Claire closed her laptop with an audible snap and stood. Thank you for coming. Elena, we'll be in touch once decisions are finalized. Elena stood as well, nodding once. Thank you. She turned to leave, her hand already reaching for the door, when the man in the navy sweater stood as well and spoke for the first time since her arrival. Elena, he said, would you have a few minutes to talk? She paused, hand on the chrome handle. Of course. Claire's expression didn't flicker, but Elena noticed a stillness in her shoulders. Whatever this man represented, it carried weight. The others cleared out with quiet efficiency, some glancing at Elena, others not at all. Within moments, the conference room was empty except for the 2 of them. He gestured toward the chairs again. Please, sit. She did, this time more composed. He didn't sit right away, walked instead to the window, looking out over Midtown. Then he turned, arms crossed, studying her. My name is David Keller, he said. I'm an external partner. My fund is a majority stakeholder in Hudson Elite. She blinked. That explained the subtle authority in the room. He hadn't just been present. He was watching, measuring everything. I didn't expect to speak today, Elena said. I didn't expect to care, he replied bluntly. But I did. He moved back to the table and finally sat, folding his hands. I grew up in Flatbush, she continued. 1-bedroom apartment. My mother cleaned buildings not so different from this one. I used to wait for her in the lobbies, watching her push the mop cart down marble hallways. I remember how people looked through her. And when you walked in today, breathless, explaining why, it hit a nerve I thought I'd buried. Elena didn't speak. She wasn't sure she could. The quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with something unspoken and real. "I'm not here to play savior," David added, "but I know what invisibility looks like, and I know talent when I see it." She tilted her head slightly. "Talent. I read your file," he said. 3 years at the front desk. You restructured the appointment flow to cut wait times by 18%. You introduced bilingual intake forms that improved satisfaction scores across multiple clinics. And you trained 2 interns who are now supervisors. Elena looked at the table, unsure what to say. No one had ever listed those things aloud before. They were things she had done because they needed to be done, not because anyone noticed. "Why haven't you moved up before now?" David asked. She met his eyes. "I didn't fit the mold." "Which is?" he prompted. "Elite, blonde, Ivy League, disposable income for Pilates and Patagonia jackets. Not someone who takes the subway from the Bronx and still smells like coffee ground from her second job." David exhaled through his nose, almost a laugh, but not quite. "Claire and her team think in frameworks," he said. "Profiles, predictable pathways. You're not predictable." "Is that a bad thing?" she asked. "No," he said, leaning forward. "It's exactly what this place needs." He paused, letting the words settle. "I don't know what you expected from today," he continued, "but I'm going to tell you what I saw. Someone who kept walking when they didn't have to. Someone who showed up tired, pissed off, but still sharp. That kind of grit doesn't just belong here. It belongs higher." Elena felt her throat tighten, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "And what do you want from me?" David smiled slightly. "I want your story. I want your insight. And I want you to consider something bigger than promotion." The fluorescent lights above them buzzed faintly. Outside the window, traffic swarmed like ants down below, indifferent and constant. But inside that room, something rare had taken root. Recognition without pity, opportunity without condescension. "I don't make promises," David said finally, "but I make space. And I can make space for you, if you're willing to step into it." Elena sat back in her chair, unsure of the future but certain of one thing. This was the first time she wasn't being asked to shrink in order to fit. She was being asked to rise, on her own terms. The following afternoon, Elena sat alone on the edge of her twin mattress in the small apartment she shared with her aging father in the Bronx. The sun filtered weakly through the half-closed blinds, striping the faded carpet with pale gold. A mug of lukewarm coffee sat untouched on the windowsill. The events of the previous day looped in her mind, relentless, like a song she couldn't shut off. Not the humiliation in the lobby, not even the climb itself, but the moment after, when David Keller had looked at her not with pity, but with recognition. That was what stayed. It didn't comfort her, not exactly. It unsettled her. She wasn't used to being seen that clearly. The idea of space being made for her, a path that wasn't dictated by rules she never agreed to, felt like a door someone had left ajar. But doors like that had closed on her too many times to count. She remembered interviews where the rejection came the moment she walked in. She remembered the manager who had complimented her on her grit, only to pass her over for someone with a country club last name. And she remembered the way her father used to tell her, gently but firmly, that in America, the stairs would always be there for people like them, not as a challenge, but as a default. Later that evening, her phone buzzed with a text. It was from an unknown number, but the message was unmistakably David's tone. "I'm in town all week. If you have time to talk further, I'd like to hear more about what you've seen and what you'd change." A simple sentence, but it hummed with weight. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she folded laundry in silence, checked on her father, and watched as another day ended the way so many had. With fatigue, with quiet resolve, with the uneasy balance between survival and ambition. The next morning, Elena found herself sitting across from David at a small cafe tucked between office towers near Bryant Park. He had chosen a place without formality, where suits weren't mandatory, and no one looked twice at someone wearing scuffed boots. She arrived early. He arrived on time, over coffee and half-eaten croissants. David asked her questions that no one at Hudson Elite had ever bothered to. Not about her resume, he had already read that, but about the work behind it. What systems had she built from the ground up? What patterns had she observed in the way patients interacted with the front desk versus how they were treated in the back rooms? What unspoken biases filtered into how staff were promoted, mentored, or ignored? At first, she was cautious. She had spent years editing herself, learning how to speak just enough truth to be considered honest, but never enough to make others uncomfortable. But David didn't interrupt. He didn't redirect. He asked, and he waited. So she spoke. She spoke about the time a patient had assumed she didn't speak English because of her last name, about the corporate manager who had laughed when she suggested implementing patient feedback forms in Spanish, about how every innovation she'd introduced had to be framed as someone else's idea to be accepted, about how she trained new hires who were later promoted above her without explanation. "You ever file a formal complaint?" David asked, his expression unreadable. "No," she said. "I needed the job, and I've seen what happens to the ones who complain." He nodded slowly, sipping his coffee. "You're not wrong." For a moment, they sat in silence. Outside, the city moved in its relentless rhythm, deliveries, sirens, chatter, footsteps. But inside the cafe, the air felt dense with a different kind of energy, reckoning. David leaned forward. "I've been thinking," he said. "The promotion you applied for, it's on hold. Claire's team will probably rework the qualifications, maybe bring in a consultant to justify their decisions. You'll get a nice thank you for your time and an email that pretends the whole thing was fair." Elena stared at him. "You're saying I have no shot?" "I'm saying the game was never built for you to win it." The bluntness stung, but it didn't surprise her. She had lived that truth. It just felt jarring to hear it spoken aloud, especially by someone who sat on the other side of the table. The kind of person whose signature could rewrite job descriptions, whose silence could keep systems intact. "I want to offer you something else," he said. "Something real." She raised an eyebrow. "What does that mean?" "There's a pilot program we've been sketching out," he explained. "A talent development initiative across all our portfolio companies. Early stage, still in formation. I need someone who's lived the other side of it, not just as a story, but as a lens. You're not a checkbox. You're a strategist. You see cracks because you've lived in them." She didn't answer immediately. This wasn't just another offer. It was a risk. To say yes meant leaving behind what little certainty she had. It meant stepping into a space she wasn't even sure existed, one that hadn't been built yet, one where she might still be seen as an outsider. "And what if I say no?" she asked. David shrugged. "Then you keep doing what you've been doing, and eventually you'll build your own elevator. But I'm offering a shortcut, not to the top, but to the place where you can actually change something." Elena looked at her hands. She thought about the mornings she woke up before dawn, the bus rides through quiet streets, the hours behind a desk where she was polite but not seen. She thought about the years of doing more with less, of being told to wait her turn. But more than anything, she thought about the girls coming after her, the ones who would wear borrowed heels and ride the stairs because no one ever offered a better way. "I want to see the proposal," she said finally. "I want to know exactly what you're building." David smiled. "Good." That night, as she sat at her desk, reading through a document David had sent, outlining the goals, the scope, the risks, Elena felt something shift, not just in her circumstances, but in her center. For so long, she had been trying to climb someone else's structure. Now, for the first time, she was being invited to design the blueprint. She didn't know yet if this would work. She didn't know if the culture would change, or if she'd still find herself hitting the same ceilings, only higher up. But what she did know was this. Someone had listened, and then offered more than sympathy. They had offered power. The news came not through an announcement or a meeting, but through whispers, low, cautious voices in the hallway outside the staff kitchen, hurried glances exchanged between colleagues who suddenly seemed more careful in Elena's presence. The promotion she had applied for had been quietly paused, not canceled outright, not officially reassigned, just suspended for review, according to the HR email that landed in her inbox one Thursday morning. No explanation, no apology, just a few polite sentences buried under administrative language, followed by a line thanking all applicants for their patience and professionalism. She read the message 3 times, each word landing with mechanical detachment. There was no surprise. But there was disappointment. Not for herself. She had already begun to imagine a life beyond that narrow title. But for predictability of it all, she could almost see the strategy behind the email. A quiet retreat. No confrontation. Let time pass and let her forget. But she hadn't forgotten. And others hadn't either. That afternoon, a colleague, Miriam, from accounting, caught Elena in the hallway and leaned in, speaking low. "People are talking," she said, "about the meeting, about you being told to take the stairs." Elena stiffened, unsure whether it was sympathy or judgment coming next. Miriam's voice softened. "Some of us have been in that stairwell, too. We just didn't say it out loud." It was a first ripple, a sign that something beneath the surface had begun to move. Days passed. Elena kept her routine, but the air around her felt changed. She noticed the subtle shifts, emails where she was now copied where she hadn't been before, polite smiles from people who used to walk past her without a glance. None of it felt sincere. It was not respect. It was recognition of disruption. And institutions, especially those built on polished appearances, did not respond well to disruption. She stayed quiet, observant, measured. Then, on a Tuesday morning, she received an email unlike the others. It was from David. The subject line was brief. Invitation. The message inside was even more direct. "There's a project I'd like you to join. It's not public yet. It won't be safe, but it will be worth it. Let me know if you're ready." Attached was a non-disclosure agreement and a draft proposal for a company-wide initiative. The Inclusion Access Framework. Not a diversity pamphlet or a mentorship facade, but structural redesign of hiring, training, and promotion policies across the entire holding company that owned Hudson Elite and several other subsidiaries. It included data models, historical inequity charts, compensation disparity matrices. But what caught Elena's eye was a section titled Barriers and Broken Pathways, which outlined real case studies of how qualified internal staff, largely women of color and immigrant background employees, had been systematically overlooked despite performance. At the end of the proposal, a blank line followed a question: who should lead this change internally? Elena stared at the screen. There was no name written there, but the question itself was a message. She replied with one sentence: "Let's talk." 2 days later, she met David again, this time not at a cafe, but at one of the smaller conference rooms in a shared office space he used when he wanted to avoid the main Hudson building. The walls were bare. The table was scratched. It felt honest. He didn't waste time. "You'll have resistance," he said. "Claire is already aware I'm building something parallel. She hasn't tried to block it yet, but she will once it threatens her pipeline." Elena didn't flinch. "Let her try. I want you inside the pilot team," he continued. "Not as a token, not as decoration. You'll co-lead it. You'll set the terms for how we identify internal candidates for leadership. You'll redesign the intake flow for frontline talent. You'll help build out a mentoring cohort that isn't just a panel once a quarter, but actual career tracking." She leaned back, arms crossed. "You're going to give me the power to do that? I'm going to give you the space. The power is what you already have." There was no contract yet, no title, just a shifting of roles, of dynamics, of what could be imagined. Elena asked about budget, about authority, about legal pushback. David answered everything with the coolness of someone who'd already run 5 scenarios ahead. "You'll have executive access," he said. "You'll report directly to me. But you'll operate within the company's HR matrix, which means they'll test you, ignore you, maybe even sabotage you." "And if they do?" she asked. He smiled slightly. "Then we'll remind them who holds the capital." It wasn't ideal. It wasn't a utopia. But it was more than she had ever been offered. And it came without a demand to change who she was. The following Monday, Elena walked into the building to the front entrance. No one stopped her. She passed the security desk with a nod, not waiting for permission. The elevator opened without resistance. She ascended, not breathless this time, but focused. At the 28th floor, a temporary office had been cleared for her. No nameplate, just a laptop and a notebook waiting on the desk. But it was enough. Within days, she began assembling data, quietly at first, pulling metrics on internal transfers, looking at where promising entry-level employees had stalled. She met with team leads, listened more than she spoke, tracked where the system bent and where it broke. Her presence didn't go unnoticed. Some executives greeted her with strained courtesy. Others ignored her entirely. A few, bolder, asked outright what she was doing there. Building something new, she'd say. No further explanation. But the HR director, a woman named Allison who had served under Claire for nearly a decade, requested a formal meeting. They met in the boardroom, sunlight pouring in through floor-to-ceiling windows. Allison wore a tight smile, her fingers laced perfectly on the table. "I hear you're working on an internal initiative," she said. "That's right," Elena replied, calm. "And I assume you've been authorized?" Elena reached into her folder and slid across a printed letter, signed by David Keller himself, appointing her as co-strategic lead of the Inclusion Access Framework. Allison read it. Her smile didn't fade, but it hardened. "Well," she said, placing the paper down, "let's make sure we stay aligned on messaging." Elena didn't smile back. "Let's make sure we stay aligned on outcomes." It was the first open challenge. It wouldn't be the last. But as she left the room, Elena felt no fear. She had spent years waiting at locked doors. Now, she was holding the keys. Autumn arrived without ceremony. The wind picked up to the streets of Manhattan, scattering leaves along the curbs and brushing past suits and sneakers alike with equal indifference. Inside the Hudson Elite headquarters, the air was different now, tighter, more alert. The tone of whispered conversations in the hallways had changed from curiosity to calculation. People hadn't noticed Elena, not because of what she had said, but because of what she had started to do. The Inclusion Access Framework was no longer a proposal quietly floating through inboxes. It had begun to take shape. Weekly meetings, internal workshops, interviews with staff across departments and seniority levels. Elena had created anonymous surveys, implemented listening sessions, and demanded data transparency on everything from compensation brackets to promotion history. She didn't just gather information. She connected it. Patterns emerged, and those patterns pointed to systemic bias, so glaring that even those who had always benefited from it could no longer deny it outright. Some bristled. Others attempted to reframe the initiative in softer language, diversity moments, inclusion touchpoints, equity enhancements. But Elena refused to dilute the language. This wasn't about optics. It was about structure. She now worked 2 offices down from the same executive boardroom where she had once been told, politely but firmly, that the promotion wasn't available. She had been given no new title. Yet her name appeared on internal communications with strategic authority. Every document related to the new program carried her initials. She no longer waited for permission to speak in meetings. People deferred to her, some with genuine respect, others with carefully hidden resentment. Still, she did not let herself be consumed by the politics of perception. Her focus remained on the people who had once stood in the same place she had. Cleaning staff who were invisible after hours, receptionists whose bilingual skills were used but never rewarded, nurses who had trained up to managerial readiness only to be told to wait for the right moment. Elena began building a database of names, not just metrics. She tracked stories, not just numbers. She made it impossible for the company to treat people like background noise. She also made space. Through David's backing, she created a paid internship program specifically for underrepresented candidates across all company departments. She ensured the hiring panel for every leadership role included someone from a framework team. She introduced cultural competency training that was not a slideshow, but a simulation, real-world scenarios where executives were forced to see how implicit bias shaped outcomes. But her most radical move came one morning when she entered the very same elevator that had once been closed to her. She had organized an orientation session for the new cohort of interns, a group handpicked through the revised hiring model she had helped design. They came from public schools, from underfunded neighborhoods, from immigrant families. Some had never stepped into a corporate building before. Their resumes were full of part-time jobs, volunteer roles, community projects, nothing that would have passed the old filters. But Elena didn't want what the old system filtered. She wanted what excluded. She met the group in the lobby at 7:30 in the morning. Most of them were early, nervous, dressed in carefully chosen clothes that spoke of effort and restraint. One young woman wore a blazer 2 sizes too big. A young man had polished his shoes, so thoroughly the leather had cracked. Elena saw herself in every glance, every fidget, every breath they took to steady themselves before stepping through glass doors that weren't built with them in mind. "Everyone ready?" she asked, voice steady. They nodded. Some smiled, unsure if they should. "Let's go to the top." She led them to the main elevator, past the same security guard who had once stopped her. He didn't speak, but his eyes followed her movement. This time, she didn't glance away. She met his gaze without flinching. Something flickered in his expression. Recognition, discomfort, maybe even guilt. She didn't pause long enough to unpack it. The elevator ride was smooth, the floor numbers lighting up one by one. Some of the interns shifted nervously, looking at the polished interior, the mirrored walls. Elena looked straight ahead. When the doors opened at the 28th floor, David was standing there, holding 2 cups of coffee. One was clearly for her. "Right on time," he said. Then he turned to the interns. "Welcome. You're not just part of the future. You're part of the fix." Elena stepped forward and introduced each of them, not as hopefuls or rookies, but as contributors, young professionals whose potential had nothing to do with pedigree and everything to do with perspective. The rest of the morning was filled with orientation materials, team introductions, breakout sessions. Elena stayed with them, answered their questions, shared her own missteps without sugarcoating the truth. When asked how she made it here, she didn't say she worked harder than everyone else or that perseverance was all it took. She told them plainly, the system isn't broken. It was built this way, but now we're rebuilding it. After lunch, the group toured different departments. One of the interns, a quiet girl named Janelle with wide eyes and a habit of tucking her braids behind her ears, pulled Elena aside. "I didn't think someone like me could work here," she said, almost a whisper. Elena knelt slightly to meet her eyes. "Neither did I," she replied. "But someone waited for me at the top. Now it's my turn to wait for you." Later that evening, long after the interns had gone home and the floors had emptied of their usual traffic, Elena remained. Her office light was the only one still on. David passed by on his way out and paused at her doorway. "You're changing this place faster than I expected," he said. She leaned back in her chair, exhaustion softening her expression. "Not fast enough, but it's starting." He nodded, then placed a folded paper on her desk. It was a printout of an internal memo, a draft to be sent company-wide the following week. It read, "As part of our cultural reset, Elena Martinez will assume the role of Executive Director of Inclusion Strategy, effective immediately." She didn't react outwardly, but her fingers tightened slightly around the paper. "It's official then?" she asked. "Your name goes on the masthead next month," David confirmed. "You'll be visible." Elena glanced toward the window. The skyline was sharp, lit by countless windows glowing against the night. "I've always been visible," she said. "They just didn't want to see me." He nodded, knowing better than to say anything else. After he left, Elena remained in her chair for a long time, not thinking about what she had achieved, but about what still needed to be done. She knew the culture wouldn't transform overnight. She knew there would be pushback. But now, she was no longer climbing alone. She was the one holding the elevator door open, and someone was always waiting at the top.